recording so that. So thank you very much all for attending today's webinar. This is the second webinar in the frame of the TWIN4MERIT project. The TWIN4MERIT project is the acronym for Twinning for Excellence in Management and Economics of Research and Innovation. It's a project funded by the Horizon Europe program, the WIDERA, specifically the WIDERA program, and the Twinning Action. It's a partnership between the University of Cyprus, Maastricht University, University Carlos III de Madrid, and the European Office of Cyprus. And its emphasis is on the fields that are related to research and innovation policies, research assessment, gender in research, and meta-research as a whole, as an umbrella field for the whole project. Today's webinar is the second webinar taking place within the framework of the project. It's titled Meta-Research and Policy, the Role of Social Sciences. It will be delivered by Professor Zach Maniadis, the ERA Chair in Science and Innovation Policy and Studies, who is also the scientific leader of the TWIN4MERIT project. And we'll be very excited to hear the most recent developments in the field, especially now in the era of the reform of research assessment. These topics are very important in understanding how meta-research can support evidence-based and science-informed policies. As I told you, Professor Zach Maniadis is our ERA Chair for Science, Innovation, Policy and Studies. He's the director of the Synopsis Research Unit. He's an expert in meta-research. He has recently published papers related to research assessment, research metrics, and the role of meta-research. And we're looking forward to hearing to Zach's insights about this very interesting topic. Zach, thank you very much for delivering today's webinar. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for this invitation. And of course, we acknowledge generous funding by the European Commission for the TWIN4MERIT project. Today, the talk will be rather general and not very technical. So it will be an overview of existing research and how it relates to the social phenomenon related to the credibility crisis in science and in research assessment. So what we're going to be discussing today is, first of all, a small introduction into the interdisciplinary domain of meta-research and its principles. Then we will see how meta-research has uncovered problems in the functioning of science in terms of the reproducibility crisis. And we will also point to the role of social sciences in the meta-research domain dealing with the reproducibility crisis. Then we will briefly speak about the scaling up problem, which means that apart from reproducibility, an issue when it comes to policy, which is also part of today's talk, relates to how the results that might be reproducible at the small scale, how they can be generalized and implemented as large-scale policies and the challenges in doing so. Then we will go to the second type of problems, the second crisis, which relates to bibliometrics, scientific metrics of scientific productivity, and the problems that have occurred, and the discussion about the responsible use of metrics and what is our own contribution with respect to this responsible use. So we can introduce the topic by just saying that very recently there have been active discussions in many countries about these reform assessments. There is also the QARA agreement, which has been signed by hundreds of parties throughout Europe, and it relates to a reform of research assessment. Actually, we are part of one of the working groups of QARA pertaining to responsible innovations. So this is a very active topic of discussion. So let me just take a few steps back and introduce the issue. First of all, we might want to speak about the science of examining science itself. let us think about some young researcher starting a research career. Of course, it's very likely that the scientist in point is going to be idealistic, taking the point of view of why do we do science. First of all, we want to discover truths about the world around us. We want to change the world. In other words, try to use science to predict and affect the future by providing policy advice. And of course, doing so requires that research be reproducible, credible, and scalable. So it can be scaled into large-scale interventions. Now, the problem pertains to the comparison between idealistic and actually science as it is conducted. Again, starting researchers want to discover truths about the world. They are willing to expand our range of knowledge. But we have to realize that science is a human institution, and scientists are human beings, and therefore they are imperfect, and they have their own rules and dynamics, and they can be studied using the scientific method. Now, examples of this divergence between the idealistic and the real science can be social pressures for affecting the scientist's interest. So instead of pursuing their own interest, it might be the case that scientists follow trends and follow topics that are socially acceptable. In fact, it's interesting that some type of research is so controversial and against social norms that there have been outlets such as the Journal of Controversial Ideas where other points of view can be presented. Secondly, instead of pursuing the truth, it might be the case that scientists are career-oriented, which is true to a larger or smaller degree for all of us, and therefore they respond to economic incentives, as economists firmly believe, and therefore this might distort the way that science is conducted. And of course, related to that, there are the other social pressure apart from society as a whole and apart from career concerns of the expectations of advisors, group leaders, heads of department, funders, and so on and so forth. So therefore comes the problem of how do we study actual science as it is conducted in the field? So first of all, we know that philosophers of science have thought of this for a long time. And for instance, there is a classical work by Thomas Kuhn on the structure of scientific revolutions, explaining how different paradigms come to replace older paradigms in science and how science evolves. Now, as opposed to this tradition, sociology and philosophy of science approach, the more recent tradition pertains to studying the workings of science quantitatively. This new domain is called meta-research, and it has been defined as the study of research itself, methods, reporting, reproducibility, evaluation, and incentives. So just a brief summary of what this new domain of meta-research involves. It speaks about the methods of science and what can go wrong with respect to methodology, biases and questionable practices, how science is summarized, research synthesis, and issues of research integrity and how they affect the application of methods. Then there is the issue of reporting. How do we report what actually are the constituents of studies that we conduct? Reporting standards, study registration, all of these aspects, how do we optimize this, and what biases exist in the field. And then the issue of reproducibility and biases and obstacles to proper reproducibility. And more related to that today's talk, which focus partly on the effect of social sciences and in particular economics in the domain of meta-research, are evaluation. How do we evaluate research? And this will be very important in the second part of the talk when we speak about the research assessment and the proposals that have been made to improve it and where our contribution comes. And finally, incentives, which is the keyword that matters most in economics. How do we align researcher incentives with the pursuit of objective and reproducible science? And as a result of these developments in the field of meta-research, there have been new institutions and developments throughout the world. With classical example, the metrics laboratory, the metrics unit in Stanford, which draws from so many different disciplines that it is very interesting case study of interdisciplinary research, drawing for physics, biomedicine, ecology, and psychology, and among others. So what have we learned from meta-research? What is the main message that we have obtained from meta-research? Unfortunately, in the last 2 decades, meta-research has taught us that it is possible that there have been a problem, a crisis of science, where the truth wears off. In other words, there have been a large set of domains whereby established and existing knowledge that has been believed by researchers and even introduced in textbooks and affected policy. In subsequent studies, the initial effects pertaining especially to experimental domains are much weaker and often different from the original studies. This is the meaning of such an expression, the truth wears off, which was published in a 2010 New Yorker article, which was extremely interesting and sparked our interest in the domain of meta-research. So the question is whether there is a credibility crisis in science affecting domains from biomedical and behavioral to ecology and social sciences. And of course, as economists, we trace the problem to incentives of that researchers face. And one of the most important aspects that might distort science is the desire of researchers to report positive results, to discover new phenomena, rather than declare null results that can be characterized as undeciding on the particular research question, and how this might distort the evidence that we observe. And this can be seen in this graph by work of Daniele Fanelli, which shows the percentage of articles in different scientific domains that report positive results. As we can see across the boards, the percentage of positive results is greater than 70%, but it can be argued that the percentage of positive results increases as we move to, if you wish, softer sciences, although this is not strictly monotonic. So this is a message about the potential bias in science, that the reason that this can occur can be traced maybe to publication bias, whereby we don't see published null results so often as positive results. And in addition to this pursuit of positive results, there might come the cases where there is research misbehavior. When it comes to the most extreme form of misbehavior, fraud and fabrication of data, we see that from other evidence, about 3%, 2 to 3% of scientists admit to conduct that kind of misbehavior. Of course, this can be an understatement, knowing that these are sensitive issues and one would be hesitant to report these. And ultimately, this reproducibility crisis can be traced also to reporting standards and flexibility in statistical analysis. And this has been a little bit parodied in a famous study with the dead salmon, whereby they analyzed, using acceptable standards in the particular domain of neuroscience, the neural characteristics of a particular subject, and they reached out interesting results. But the problem was that the subject was non-human, but it belonged to the the evidence belonged to a dead salmon, but they reach interesting conclusions behaviorally with respect to this. This is just an extreme example whereby science can lead us to problematic conclusions based on the existing standards of analysis. Then we can summarize a little bit this so-called replication crisis by pointing into two replication initiatives, one that can be traced in economics and one in psychology. And roughly speaking, and this corresponds to other sciences as well, it has been found that about 1/3 to 2/3 of findings cannot be replicated. So that gives us a little bit of a quantitative number about the credibility crisis. And then one can ask, how can meta-research pinpoint, show us which are the particular individual practices that might be behind the problems that have been discussed before with respect to the reproducibility crisis. First of all, it can be argued that there is pure research misbehavior, such as falsification, p-hacking, and selective reporting. This, if you want, might be, in our view, the tip of the iceberg. So most scientists are not conducting this kind of misbehavior. However, it has been traced in the data. More importantly, there are the degrees of freedom that represent a gray zone with respect to what can be reported. So especially in new domains, there are no reporting standards regarding what characteristics of a study, an experiment, an analysis, and statistical analysis that need to be conveyed to the other researchers in order to be able to reproduce a study. So in such domains where there is a lot of flexibility, human subjectivity and the desire to find positive results might be leading us to this selection of positive results that might be distorting actual science. To put it simply, when an initial researcher conducts a study, they know what kind of outcome they want to produce. And if they are very flexible in how they present the experiments and the analysis, it's very likely that they will find some sort of statistical association, perhaps by examining a large set of models and hypotheses that will support this conclusion. However, this can be characterized as a problematic practice because it doesn't correct for multiple comparisons, for instance, and therefore, when this result is replicated, this particular statistical significance result is likely not to be present. That's why degrees of freedom can be particularly problematic. In addition, there is the problem of incomplete documentation of methods, procedures, and data that relate to the previous problem of degrees of freedom and how insufficient reporting matters. And then finally, of course, as human beings, it can be the case that scientists conduct honest errors, and for example, in the software, and as science grows and the research teams become larger and larger and the analysis more complex, this is very important to be mindful of this sort of errors. So this is a little bit the description of the setting up the stage of the new domain of research called meta-research and what kind of practices it has identified as problematic. So where does our research come? In a set of papers together with colleagues such as Fabio Tufano, John List, and John Ioannidis, we have been able to trace some of the characteristics of a domain of study that might be positive and some that might be negative with respect to our confidence in the scientific results. We use the concept of post-study probability, which express the confidence in a new finding being actually true, conditional on this finding being declared in a particular study. So we have found that in domains where there are large sample sizes, appropriate power analysis, and sufficient participants, the post-study probability tends to be higher. We should be more trusting more the results from these domains. Other positive attributes are domains that are strong in theory. When there is a good background of theory pointing to particular results, this will tend to provide us, before an experimental study or an empirical study, with high priors. In other words, there are solid theoretical foundations, there are solid scientific reasons to expect a result. If this is the case, then we should be more confident in the results of a particular study. And then, of course, if the domain is open to exact replication and we observe exact replications, this tends to increase our confidence pretty fast about whether a particular result is true. And finally, positive practices such as pre-registration tend also, of course, to increase our trust in particular domains. And as an environment, as a domain matures in science, we observe more of these positive practices, and therefore this is an optimistic message for science, that although it has faced problems, it tends to correct as the time goes through. On the other hand, there might be factors that are negative for our trust in the scientific results, that relate, as we explained before, to methodological flexibility, to domains that are extremely competitive and are combined with the problem of publication bias, to domains whereby it is not common to conduct replication, or the types of replications that are conducted tend to be shy of contradicting initial results. That's the concept of sympathetic replication. Domains of replications whereby there is a bias towards confirming results of the initial study, and domains where there are strong conflicts of interest also reduce our confidence in particular results. So this is part of our work in this domain. And in addition, on top of providing this characterization of our trust in the in scientific domains, we have argued before that in a domain of meta-research that has been unexplored and needs to be developed further is the role of social sciences, and in particular economics. To put it in context, most contributions in meta-research come from biomedicine and psychology, but economics has a greater role to play, and we have explained how this is the case. Oftentimes, we observe complex phenomena in science, and we think about how to analyze those. For instance, there have been suggestions about reforms of scientific practices and scientific institutions. Economics is the discipline, together with other social sciences, that studies institutions, and therefore has a lot to teach us in meta-research. For instance, new proposals and changes in scientific practices involve consequences in terms of interaction among multiple agents. Also, these kind of reforms involve the consideration of trade-offs, costs and benefits, and the need to analyze this in a rigorous way. Oftentimes, we can see that these phenomena involve heterogeneous information and beliefs. So how will this be affected by changes in scientific practices? And that they require the design of experiments. In all of these domains, economics and social sciences has a lot to teach us. For example, game theory can be used to analyze interaction among many agents. The mature discipline of welfare economics can be used for comparing trade-offs as costs and benefits in a rigorous way for society. Principal agent models and application of game theory, again, using mechanism design, can capture the consequences of changing institutions in the presence of heterogeneous information and beliefs. And then what a tradition of field experiments in economics can inform the design of experiments to examine what happens when scientific institutions change. So this has been another contribution on our side, and a summary of these arguments in favor of using economics in the domain of meta-research can be described as following. Esther Duflo, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, said, "What the economics brings to the table, in addition to evaluation expertise, is prior evidence and theories that help them to predict what should work and how and what should not. The evaluation of the program then serves to test of these theories. Randomized evaluations have become, in effect, field experiments, a new and powerful tool in the arsenal of the economist." Just for an application of these principles of using economic theory, we have published a paper with a simple model to examine the effects of transparency in science. The way that we model it is extremely simple. We assume that there are two forms of potential misbehavior of scientists. One is a mild form of misbehavior, again, getting advantage of gray areas in what is reported and what is not reported, whereby they omit to report important information. This is the first form of potential misbehavior. The second form of misbehavior is pure fabrication or fraud. They consciously misreport the evidence. What we show is the possibility to assess what is the best way to proceed. When you have these two forms of misbehavior, what is the best policy to follow? We have shown, using a simple tournament environment whereby there is competition for publication and performing stronger forms of misbehavior than other scientists tends to give an advantage in publication, perhaps because you get more significant results, tends to have a simple solution in terms of what policy to follow, which is to rule out mild forms of misbehavior. In other words, have transparency requirements such that they don't allow lying by omission. So they don't allow for gray areas. We show that we don't need to find ways such as auditing to deal with pure fraud, because the incentives for pure fraud will reduce when the mild forms of misbehavior are ruled out. Put very simply, pure fraud can be used as a defensive mechanism when the other researchers tend to be following also problematic practices in terms of transparency. When these practices are not possible, we show that scientific fraud will also decrease. So transparency can be positive both for tackling misbehavior by omission as well as commission. So moving ahead from the possible role of economics and social sciences in the domain of meta-research, we need to focus also on the problem of scaling up. This talk is about policy, so it is important to consider the second aspect. The first aspect we have talked about so far is reproducibility. The degree to which scientific studies provide similar results when conducted independently by other researchers. On top of that, however, there is another aspect. When we take the evidence from scientific studies, we might scale them up as policies in the general population and in conducting particular policies in the field. Now, the question comes, even if scientific studies are reproducible, even if different scientific studies tend to point in the same direction, does this mean that they are useful for society, performed as large-scale policies? And the answer is, it is not clear, it is not obvious. There is also the concept of the scaling up problem that can take the following form. Unfortunately, many things change when we take scientific small-scale evidence and we scale it up into a policy. For instance, we might take small class experiments that show a particular style of teaching as effective, and infer from those that it is possible to conduct a policy that affects a whole area, whole city, and the schools of this area. What can go wrong in the scaling up of scientific interventions is that they are not generalizable because a different population is targeted. It's not the population that is prone to scientific study that could be biased because they might be volunteers. So we have a different population that the policy is applied as opposed to the initial small-scale experiment. Importantly, those who administer the intervention, for instance, the exact way of teaching that we mentioned before, they might be less specialized. Of course, in the initial study, the researchers took a personal interest in having as people who administer the intervention, people specially trained, capable of doing that. The more that a policy is scaled, the supply for such specialized personnel reduces. So it is natural to expect that when the results are scaled up, the quality of administrators falls. And another reason for this to happen is that, as we explained before, we move from incentivized by researchers and specialized personnel to public servants who might not have as strong incentives. And finally, it might be important that the eligibility conditions for participation might change. Again, this relates to the problem of generalizable population. So far, we have spoken about what meta-research is. We have spoken about what meta-research reveals, a potential credibility crisis in science. We emphasized the role of social science in the domain of meta-research, and we spoke briefly about the scaling up problem of scientific results into policies. Now, in the second part of our discussion, we will speak about a twin crisis together with the problem of reproducibility. The problem with scientific metrics. It is, as we will see, this is closely related. So if we are to deal with the problem of reproducibility crisis, we need to provide appropriate incentives to scientists. But in order to provide incentives, we need to think about rewards for performing good science. As long as there is a nice and appropriate system to allocate credit, scientific credit, and culpability for misbehavior, we can be confident that these incentives will be able to be changed and point us to the correct direction. Unfortunately, and this is a little bit of a pessimistic message, this is not the case. In other words, it has been argued that there is a problem in terms of traditional bibliometrics. The general problem pertains to the use of the H index, the impact factor, citation metrics in assessing researchers. So for those of you that are not involved in research, it is a serious challenge to think about what each particular researcher has contributed in every piece of research. Many times we have large research teams with dozens of contributors, and oftentimes people publish multiple papers in a single year. So it is a little bit difficult to allocate measures of productivity. So to summarize, in order to appropriately change incentives in science, to push science in the right direction, we need to change the incentives of researchers. Incentives mean rewarding productivity. But if productivity is very difficult to capture, then we find ourselves in a difficult position. And this is where we are now. There have been active discussions regarding publication and citation counts and the traditional bibliometrics. So what can go wrong? This is a little bit more specific to experienced researchers who will understand this crisis. in bibliometrics, apologies, we can see that researchers have found ways to abuse the traditional bibliometrics in order to show themselves in a more favorable light. In terms of authorship, unfortunately, it is difficult to ascertain what each particular person has contributed in a large team, and therefore we observe the massive authorship of papers without meriting credit. For instance, a lab leader or a person obtaining authority might put their names in a large set of papers without appropriate contribution. In a similar vein, it might be that different teams have different standards with respect to authorship. So in generous teams, it might be the case that researchers have multiple publications, although they might not necessarily merit this credit, versus in other teams, it might be a little bit less generous, and therefore might putting their researchers at a disadvantage when it comes to traditional metrics. In terms of citations, focus has been given in the problem of self-citations. Some researchers might be particularly prone to massive self-citations to push themselves into higher measures of citations. In addition, it might be the case that they strategically target citations or self-citations such that they show them with a very positive H index. This is characterized as H index gaming. However, these are not the only problems that have been shown in the domain of bibliometrics. Other problems might take place at the editorial level, whereby there is nepotism towards the social contacts of particular editors, or even editors who themselves find the opportunity to publish widely in their own journals. And finally, there is the concept of journal impact factor gaming, whereby the journals try to self-cite a lot of their articles. And the more difficult concept to ascertain, which is paper mills and spurious contact papers. In this case, you might have the possibility that that journals have very low standards, and they don't. The publications that come in some types of journals are not the same as the ones that are part of quality journals. In other words, there might be particular publishing companies whose standards are very low, but the metrics can be gamed by such by the existence of such journals, both at the publication and at the citation level. So these are just a few examples of what might go wrong in terms of the traditional bibliometrics. So the question is, given these factors, what can be done? With some proposals, such as the Coara movement, it has been pointed in the direction of use quantitative metrics less and use qualitative assessment more. I couldn't agree more with this statement that as long as it is possible, it should be followed. We should have high quality peers reviewing in depth the quality of papers of our colleagues in order to ascertain the quality of scholarship. Unfortunately, for most institutions throughout the world, this quality peer review is a scarce resource, which means that it is very difficult to demand from resource-poor institutions to go in the direction of more peer review. Oftentimes, scholars in these institutions lack the time or expertise to perform this peer review. That's why we think that the more promising approach is to try to improve and to deal with the problems of of bibliometrics, improving quantitative bibliometrics rather than abandoning them? There is a question in the chat. Noting that review can also be prone to nepotism. Of course, this is also a problem, and there have been suggestions about how to deal with how to transform the peer review system, for instance, by using open peer review, which has advantages and disadvantages. But the aspect of nepotism will be, for instance, ameliorated if the peer reviews are open. So again, to summarize, there are problems with the current metric system, but we argue that in order to empower weaker institutions and not strong institutions such as the University of Cyprus, where we are located, but in more resource-constrained countries, we need to find a way to help these researchers there in using quantitative metrics that are much less costly to use than peer review by established and capable researchers. Again, the University of Cyprus might have the resources, and indeed this is the case, to conduct high-quality reviews by external reviewers when they are promoting or hiring scientists. But it's not necessarily the case for institutions in poorer and less meritocratic environments. So for those, we argue that quantitative metrics should not be abandoned, because quantitative metrics can serve as a public good. In other words, they are developed once and can be used by different institutions without additional cost, except the judgment of, again, qualitative judgment in terms of which metrics are good and which metrics are bad. But this qualitative judgment, we have to emphasize, is much easier and much cheaper than requiring high-quality peer review by reviewing all the articles of particular researchers. This task might be impossible in many cases. So, in order to empower research-poor institutions, we have argued that we need to improve the quality of quantitative bibliometrics by making them more difficult to game. So, in two research articles, we have proposed the following. Whenever there is available bibliometric information on the following, a composite approach, a composite index could be used. In other words, let's provide an example with three different researchers who are competing, if you wish, for a particular position. What we are going to say, very simply, is that the indexes of productivity should be complemented by indexes that might show problematic practices and by other indexes that show positive practices, best practices with respect to reproducibility, open science, and so on and so forth. So if you wish, one could start in assessing these researchers by the third index, the ranking of composite citation indications in the main scientific subfield. So having a look there, we might see that all of these three researchers are close to the elite of their corresponding field in terms of citations. Now, going through in more detail to other characteristics, we might want to enrich our view of these particular researchers. One possibility is to look at self-citations. We see that researcher 2, although at the top 0.9% in terms of citations, is particularly prone, in the research team, is particularly prone to cite themselves. So that might be a type of red flag for researcher 2. In addition, there have been a database of hyper-prolific publication behavior. In other words, behavior that seems particularly spectacular in terms of publishing, but might also point to poor practices in terms of allocation of authorship. So hyper-prolific behavior has been defined as any year with more than 72 papers, which means one paper every 5 days. That might be a potential red flag as well. And we see that researcher 3 has been engaging in this practice before. So I don't want to go through all these through all of these metrics, but to show that particular metrics such as evidence of citation farm, which means a gift exchange between different authors, I cite you, you cite me, as long as it is possible by existing bibliometric data sets, it can also raise a red flag. And in this case, this is one red flag for researcher 2, for researcher 3 once more. And finally, the last set of indices might capture positive practices such as open access papers, the degree of the practice of data sharing in one's research, the proportion of papers with code sharing. So we see that researcher 1 is particularly open in their practices. So to summarize, although researcher 1 is at the top 1.4% of their composite citation index in terms of one generally accepted productivity metric, and the other two researchers seem to be faring better in terms of citation, maybe a more holistic view might make us prefer researcher 1 because of less of red flags and more positive practices in terms of open science and reproducibility. But of course, this will always require and necessitate scientific judgment. So to conclude today's talk, we have described a new interdisciplinary domain called meta-research that reveals a series of problems. Importantly, this relates to the issue of how to incentivize best practices in science. So this can be achieved by reforming researcher assessment. And we argue that quantitative metrics might have still a strong role to play. But of course, new developments need to be made in terms of providing public and open information, regarding these metrics. And right now, it seems that most of these metrics can be provided using established platforms by private companies such as Scopus of Elsevier, and therefore it might need a little bit of a reform in terms of the organization of science itself. So I have concluded. Thank you so much. We are open for questions.
Thank you very much, Zach. That was an excellent presentation. But we didn't say before that you can ask your questions through the chat or through a live discussion now with the speaker. So please feel free to ask any questions regarding the presentation.
Yes, Sophronis.
I think we should.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you, Zach. This was very interesting. So here's my question. So I agree with you with your the main topic of interest for me is the metrics. So I'm a bit of a sucker for numbers. So I love metrics, but I also have a great a lot of concerns about the way they're being used. So, and I think I agree with your approach, which I would summarize very simply as you never put too much weight on a small number of metrics. You need to look at a lot of metrics, and you need to be looking at a lot of different aspects, measures of productivity in order to assess people. The problem, and this is what I would like to say, get some your thoughts, is that a lot of what's happening, a lot of how the world works is not like that. A lot of research assessment is in practice is done with very simple metrics. People go to Google Scholar and they just see, number of citations and number of and H index. A lot of the rankings, like Times and all these rankings of universities, are based on just the number of citations, very simple metrics, 1 or 2 metrics. So how can we? So clearly, I assume you agree that this is a problem and we need to change it. So how can we, as a profession, as scientists, can we influence this and try to change this very simplistic approach to evaluating research, which is very influential? I mean, people look at this. People look at these things. People look at Times rankings. They look at Google Scholar. They just look at one number, basically. So how do we deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Sophronis. It seems to me that this will have to move in the direction of a generalized solution of recognizing that the development of this kind of composite indices can be thought of as a public good. It seems that as things are going now, you have the private publishers having their own databases of productivity, and one has to go through the individual websites in order to find these different metrics. One approach would be to agree that there are different forms of gaming the metrics, that there is some sort of consensus on what metrics would be characterized as red flags, what metrics could be characterized as following best practices, and therefore automatize maybe the approach of having a set of a collection of different metrics before this is this assessment is made. At the same time, this is not an approach that can fully replace peer review. So if you do provide this, you might be doing a perfect job. You might provide them as a public good. However, still they need to be assessed by individual researchers. One possibility one have thought in order to empower weaker institutions in this approach is to maybe consider schemes for subsidizing the quality peer review, for example, at the European level. So in institutions where it is likely that this is a scarce resource, maybe finding a way to help these institutions in getting expert advice from international experts, again, combined with the high quality metrics, this can seriously ameliorate the situation. And once more, we shouldn't be, I'll go to add a question shortly, we shouldn't be completely pessimistic. We already see expert approaches, especially in the wealthy countries. For instance, the ref only in the UK only takes advantage of a small number of publications per researcher. So many of the problems we are discussing are not fully present. Again, the institutions where we are at, the University of Cyprus has had traditionally an excellent process of international researchers and helping with the peer assessment. So there are availabilities of solutions, but again, once more, I want to emphasize this is an economic problem. There are scarce resources. If we could have unlimited resources in terms of peer assessment, I don't think that this would be the problem. That would be the first best, the top researchers in the world assessing research itself. Can I get to the next question, maybe, if Sophronis, you agree?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's ad noten with the next question.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. My name is Adnote, Maastricht University. I'm a researcher at TWIN4MERIT and dabbling in bibliometrics as well. So I agree with Zach that you know, the whole peer review process is somehow flawed. That is absolutely correct. I also think that it's an issue of resources indeed, which advantages the more wealthier countries and more wealthier institutions there. But I also agree with Sophronis that you know, people are lazy. They like to have one metric that they can focus on. You know, that was seen with the age index when it came in. People jumped on this metric as representing research excellence or researcher excellence in this case. But it's a very complex problem as well, right? Because I don't think there's a one-stop solution to this issue. First, there are disciplinary issues, right? So in economics, we do tend to publish a lot, but not as much, for instance, as in medicine, where there are huge amounts of, or other laboratory-based disciplines, where there are huge amounts of papers coming out, but also with really large teams, where, you know, the issues of that you showed of the myriad of researchers or authors on or co-authors on a paper can be immense. And also the number of papers coming out of one lab experiment can be huge. So these are difficulties that are an issue there. Also the choice of media type. Now we're focusing now on articles, but some disciplines like sociology or other humanity type of disciplines, they are very much focused on book or chapter type of outputs. Or in mathematics, they don't even bother with peer-reviewed articles. They just publish a quick conference paper, and that suffices for them. So I think there's probably not a one stop solution to this. And indeed, if there were to be a broader focus, not just on outputs or on productivity or on impact of this productivity, but for instance, a system where there is more recognition and rewards type of thing, that would be absolutely better. But then again, as you say, that's also an issue of resources. So in the Netherlands, we have this recognitions and a rewards system, which then looks also at funding, at so how many grants or what kind of grants you got in, and you know, teaching, etc., etc., to kind of broaden the picture of academic excellence or researcher excellence. But that, of course, needs a large input for the reviewers to, you know, look at a single researcher and look at all the different aspects that this researcher is covering. So yeah, I think you're absolutely, I agree with you, but I think the problem is very complex to solve.
Can I address your very last point? A difficulty that I don't know of a solution to is, as you mentioned, indisputably, there should be ways to deal with dealing with a more holistic assessment of a researcher, and if you wish, of an academic, not necessarily in the domain of research, in terms of being a good citizen, in terms of offering to the community, in terms of a more wider set of contributions. A problem that I see that is very difficult to overcome is what do you do in terms of the mobility of researchers and, for example, the international mobility of researchers. Very many times it is the case, for instance, if we want to increase the recognition that we give to locally relevant research, that this kind of behavior and this kind of practices are particularly good and rewarded at a local level for the particular institution. But then when the researcher wants to move, it is the pure research side that is instrumental and fundamental. So it seems to me that in terms of incentives, there is always a little bit of an extra focus that we give to the research side rather than the other components, because of this possibility to make us more mobile in the academic market. So this is a very difficult problem to overcome. Would you like to add? Just a second, let me.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
you're absolutely right. I think it's some kind of a catch-22 decision that a researcher needs to take. Do you want to become focused on pure research in a high-level institution somewhere, and kind of forgo with all the more socially interesting or more socially rewarding work that you can do at a local level, or do you kind of leave that to one side and focus on more locally relevant stuff, for which you then almost certainly know that you will not get the H-index kudos that you could otherwise get. So that's absolutely true. And then mobility is one thing, gender is another thing for lady researchers, which I'm not sure where we have in the house. I think we do. If you want to start a family, what are you going to do? You're going to give up your career. So these are other things that should perhaps be somewhere in that system. But okay, that's it.
Agreed. I would say that for that kind of problems, and in order to take a more holistic approach, one possibility would be to, for example, as we can see via Quora, to have an international agreement so that there is some sort of coordination of the change in research assessment. In this case, researchers who don't focus exclusively on the traditional bibliometric side might not be fallen at a disadvantage, as opposed to those who are focusing on that exclusively. So international coordination might be a solution. Sophronis has another question.
Yeah, if I can add something to that. I mean, there's a conflict in the institution there for the institution, and then institutions need to decide what their priorities are. I mean, you can do, if you want to gain international recognition as an institution, you want to do international research that gets published in the good journals and people internationally read and look at. But then if you also want to have a local impact, then let's say you live in a small country like Cyprus and you want to do some research on the Cypriot economy. It's good for the country, but it's not going to get published probably unless it's something very unique in a big international journal. As an institution, you want to have both. You have to figure out a way to give incentives to people to do both. So one way of doing it is to say, like, junior faculty, we want you to first, and you want to reconcile that with the career concerns of your faculty also, because their publications on the Cyprus economy are not going to get them a job in France or in Singapore or in the US, right? So one way to sort of handle this is say, junior faculty should focus on international publications. That they would get the international recognition, they can establish themselves internationally, also help the institution establish itself internationally. And then once you get tenure, once you get a bit older, and you have a little more of a flexibility, then you can switch focus and provide some incentives also to do other research is not as valuable internationally, but is valuable for your local impact, society, and so forth.
Well, that seems like a great idea. I wouldn't have more to comment, but that seems to be, a compromise to resolve a difficult problem. Marius has a question.
Yes, it's more like a comment on the Sophronis's ideas and on the general discussion that has been taking place, is that I agree that each institution can set their own priorities, of course, and see how they can pursue their research activities to the interest of the institution, their researchers, etc. But I believe that what we didn't mention is that things are changing. So at some point, maybe in 10 years, the new normal would be that everything will be publicly available. So perhaps by then, and perhaps open peer review will be established, or to a large extent. So at some point, perhaps the most important thing would be actually the quality of the output, not represented by the journal that they're published, but the impact that they're creating. And the impact can be measured in multiple ways. As Ad said before, the index, the rewards and recognition index that they have in the system that they have in the Netherlands is counting everything, funding, societal impact, economic impact, everything. And this is in the frame of the knowledge valorization principles that now the European Union is promoting. And of course, the QUARA agreement that has been now signed by nearly 700 institutions. I believe that we should be seeing things under the very broad but very inclusive and well-targeted term of knowledge valorization, meaning that, yes, you're producing excellent science that is internationally recognized, that's great. This is recognized. You're producing locally relevant research, again, this is great. You're helping solving global societal challenges, tackling climate change effects, again, great. Fueling policies with science-informed recommendations. If this improves the policies and consequently the quality of life, that's great again. And I believe that the evaluations should be much more inclusive in terms of different forms and types of research activities, research output, etc. And a solution, as we discussed many times with Zach, would be to also reward peer review. Now, peer review is something that academics and researchers do as donkey work. Let's be real. It's something that, yeah, puts a lot of pressure, keeps you from doing your research. So, but this is highly intellectual. It's intellectually demanding work. You need to actually review someone's many years of work that comes into a paper in your hands or into a grant proposal, and you should be objective. And at some point, this intellectually demanding work should be also rewarded. One of the key aspects of QUARA is that at some point peer review should be recognized as research output, as part of the effort. And this, I believe, this framework can solve many of the problems. Maybe it will create others, I know, but at least these new problems will be in the sphere of getting a more fair and more transparent research assessment process. And then you can indeed find ways to mitigate or eliminate the new problems that will arise that will highly likely be a result, a product of the more qualitative side of research. And yes, what Zach presented is very important because it's exactly the definition of responsible metrics. What Zach and Johnny Maniadis have produced is exactly how you use metrics for the benefit of researchers and to actually abstain from what Sophronis said, that you get a single metric and you say, okay, age index, okay, that's it. Despite the fact that this age index or this citation number may be, for example, a product of a citation farm, which you cannot realize once you see or self-citations, but you can realize it once you see this framework that Zach proposed to become a public good available for all research assessment experts. So thank you. Hopefully I didn't speak for long, but I wanted just to address the different sides of this excellent presentation. Thank you very much again, Zach, for these insights that you have provided.
Thank you, Maria. I'm looking at some comments by Ed. Yeah, as I think you mentioned, Marius, the peer review is already being used, and I would say from my personal experience, again, trying to be a little bit on the optimistic side from the institutions that I worked in the UK and also in Cyprus. But again, these are rich institutions. I have to emphasize it a lot. I would say that they take a pretty holistic assessment of contributions in terms of citizenship, in terms of, for instance, in the UK, the CV that in the particular university I was working, that you have to submit for promotion purposes, it had so many categories, and it consisted of like it ended up being almost a small book of different contributions. So I think that things are not as problematic. I think focus should be on empowering which institutions. I think Sophron is that on the global scale, we definitely are a rich institution. Michalis has a question. Oh, sorry, Michael. Please.
Hi, Zach, thanks for the presentation. You talk about the two problems of reproducibility and then with the metrics that are available for research. And clearly in the last 10, 15 years, there have been solutions for different types of problems at the level of the publishing houses, the level of the institutions and their choices, and the level of individual researchers' practices. Do you have any recommendations for the graduate students and early career researchers who have been lately trained in maybe the same practices that we have been trained ourselves some years ago, which means we are still training people in the same practices that we are now identifying as not necessarily optimal? Do you have any, you have in mind any initiatives or any practices to apply with like methods courses in graduate degrees?
Mm-hmm. I think that definitely, I don't remember on the top of my head, but definitely we have been taking into account in several institutions the best practices for open science and reproducibility, for instance. I'm pretty sure that different international excellence centers, such as BITS in Berkeley or Metrics at Stanford, other such institutions, they have been providing quite a set of educational activities. I think that it has not become mainstream, so this is very important to note. But I think that instilling to young researchers the concept that Marius emphasized, that things are changing, and a more holistic approach will need to be followed in general, and showing them, for instance, that there are important metrics that capture best practices in science. So that would be pointing to a shift in incentives. That's also important. Again, I know of educational initiatives. I'm not an expert in those, but I absolutely agree that this should be at a much larger scale. Speaking about best practices in openness, data sharing, reproducibility. to some degree, these are happening also in our institutions, right? So the libraries, is helping with this. But again, different methodologies should be used in different disciplines. But if you ask my question, I think that such a methodology course would definitely belong to the curriculum of graduate education in economics and psychology that I'm more familiar with.
And also the incentives to obtain a PhD, for example. Now we have more pressures for a doctoral student to publish 1 or 2 papers before submitting the PhD thesis, and that already puts them into a different set of incentives that they need to publish. What do I need to do to publish? Maybe find an easy journal to publish, or present part of my study that has the more positive kinds of results. So the system is still set up in the previous way that encourages the questionable research practices, or put you into a temptation to rely on some of those. Yeah,
it's the conundrum. It's the difficult compromise between providing incentives for our young researchers to do publish internationally recognized research, to do make the extra effort to be productive research-wise, which is still the most important component, and at the same time making sure that they don't get into the habit of gaming the system, and maybe changing a little bit the discussion, but keeping on the same domain. I think that a problem in the modern publication system and in the peer review, in the citation metrics, is predatory publishing, which is very difficult to define, and oftentimes not only shows you a large productivity with not much peer review in terms of quantity, but oftentimes also high recognition in terms of citations, because maybe these predatory journals also tend to be engaged in citation farming, and you have different ecosystems of publishing. So that makes it extremely difficult. How do you define a predatory journal? How do you really count productivity at the end of the day?
thanks.
Is there any other question for Zach or for the participants in the discussion? Okay, so thank you again all very much for the participation and the very interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Zach, again, of course, for delivering this excellent presentation. We will, the webinar is recorded and will be available at the website of the TWIN4MERIT project for anyone that wants to send it to colleagues that were not able to attend, or for reviewing the discussion points. Hopefully, we will see you again in the future activities of the project, the TWIN4MERIT, or the Synopsis Research Unit activities. Thank you again all. Zach, any concluding remark before we close?
That there are some, we have to be positive. There are some concerns about the way that science is proceeding and the way that research is assessed. But again, there are already best practices that have been followed. There are agreements to change things. So I think that things are proceeding in the appropriate way. And I would sum up with this.
Thank you very much, Zach. Thank you all.
Thank
Have
you.
a great afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.